I'll start with some basics, Ajay. What made you write this book and how did it come about? Can you give us some background?
Vijay Kelkar and I have been talking for a long time. We have collaborated on many products, and over the years we understood that we were putting together a whole conceptual framework on how to think about the economy, how to think about freedom, what is the role of the state, what is going wrong with the central planning, with the interference by the government, with the problems of the enforcement agencies, and how we have created an environment where private people are really afraid in the country today. So over the years we were understanding that we had been building quite a conceptual framework. The practical impetus was that at NCAER they have a distinguished lecture series which is called the C.D. Deshmukh lecture series, and Kelkar was invited to do one of the C.D. Deshmukh lectures, and he did a lecture which was called The Art and Science of Economic Policy, and that had an early preview of some of this work, and it seemed to work very well. A lot of people felt that was novel, and as you were saying, that it was important. So we got encouraged to build it out into a book scale. So that is the genesis of where the book came from.
Can you give us just an overview of what all you have included?
So first, before overview, can I just talk about the theory of the book? So imagine you are the publisher and I'm debating with you. Okay, so there are lots of public policy books in India, and the typical cycle of a public policy book in India is that there will be one chapter on electricity, and one chapter on land, and one chapter on financial markets, and one chapter on fiscal responsibility. So there are sectoral chapters which are put together, either written by one person or written by many people. There are many such books. Okay, and we felt that there was a need of first principles thinking, that there are actually some deeper principles which are applicable across all the sectors, certainly across all the sectors that we know, and actually many sectors that we do not know. We feel convinced that these are a consistent set of simple ideas which are applicable across the board. So our first concept of the book was, this is a book of concepts and ideas, not sectors. So there are 40 chapters in the book, and 4 of those chapters are examples where we use the concepts of the book to apply it to one sector. So there is one chapter on health, there is one chapter on finance, there is one chapter on GST, and there is one chapter on crisis management. So there are 4 chapters which are intended as demos, that okay, if you use these ideas and you put these ideas in motion, where does it take you in understanding one sector? But they are only demos, and maybe you're curious about health or you're not curious about health. It's not essential to the book. The remainder of the book is universal ideas and universal principles. So that was the first concept of the book, that this is a general toolkit. It can be applied into many areas, including many areas we do not know. So Kelkar always challenges me that my job now, he says, is to go study the field of climate change and write a policy paper on climate change which builds on the framework of this book, that apply the same concepts and build a chapter on climate change, which is not there here, but it is something important, it needs to be done. Okay, so this is first for the concept of the book, that it is a general set of ideas, it is a general set of principles which can be applied to many fields. The second idea of the book is that in the modern world we have all become very busy. Our minds are buzzing, our phones are buzzing, we're getting notifications all the time, we are not able to focus. So you can no longer write a 19th century tome. Okay, I wish that were not the case, but that's the world that we live in. So the concept of the book is that the chapters are bite-sized. So there are 40 chapters, and the average length of chapter is about 1800 words. So it's not very complicated to sit down for about 20 minutes and read one chapter at a time, and each chapter ends with a summing up. So you can ask yourself that, do I agree with the key arguments of this chapter or not, and then you move on to the next chapter. So it doesn't ramble too much. The attempt is to be sharp and clear, and compact chapters, go one at a time, finish an idea, move on to the next one. So that is the second concept of the book, that I think in the modern world, in today's age, given the attention span of the people that read books today, I have to constantly remind myself that I'm now way beyond the median age of India. So one has to write for a different audience today, and this is the kind of thing that matters. So this is the second idea. And the third concept of the book runs like this. As you would have seen, in the preface of the book, a very short preface, we pose the question precisely.
And I'm coming to that.
Yeah, and this is precisely the question that you pose, that what went wrong. Okay, so 91 to 2011, we had 20 years of fabulous growth. Things have not gone properly. What went wrong? In the conclusion of the book, there is like a summary answer to that question, and I'm happy to summarize afresh. But if you only read the conclusion, you will say, yeah, you have some opinions, you have some beliefs, but it's just you. How do I believe you? Why do I trust you? Okay, and the answer is the remaining 39 chapters of the book is the infrastructure that justifies chapter 40. Okay, so chapter 40 is the answer to the question. So the book starts at a question, it ends with a single essay that answers that question. But in order to get to that answer, it has to build the infrastructure of the preceding chapter. So that's the design of the book. And does that?
Do you want to come to chapter 40 now or
Maybe at the end, yeah.
Okay. There is an important para you wrote in the introduction. It says, in this process, economic policy strategy must serve the larger objective of building the republic. The foundations of liberal democracy, the principles of debate, dispersion of power, the rule of law, and the curtailing executive discretion are integral to solving the difficulties of economic policy that affect India today. This is really profound. Would you like to?
Economics in the world of business, in the world of the financial markets, very often we get a certain viewpoint, and I'm just going to caricature that viewpoint. I'm not at all implying that I agree with it. We get a viewpoint that what you need is a strong, decisive government which may veer on an authoritarian approach. We need something like a China model, which is a social contract where freedom is given up and in return you get prosperity. It may have worked for 20 years for China, but that's a different setting, that's a different problem. We are here, we have to look at India, we have to understand our problems. And our deep opinion and understanding of numerous facets of the Indian story is that where we have gone wrong in India is in not nurturing those foundations of the republic, that the only pathway to economic prosperity lies in deepening the republic, in deepening our foundations of the Constitution of India. So as economists, we're saying that there is no way to do the economics without actually doing the politics, without doing the institutions, without laying the foundations for freedom.
Which I thought was a phenomenal thought, yes.
Yeah. So we actually would distance ourselves entirely from the view of some people in the business community that growth is very important. We've got to take 500 million people in India to much higher prosperity, and if that means sacrificing some niceties, that's okay, let's get on with it. To make egg omelette, you've got to break some eggs. And that's not how we see it. Again and again, our story, our understanding of what went wrong turns on the question of checks and balances, of rule of law, of making private people safe. If the government has too much arbitrary power, then that ultimately serves to frighten away private people. Private people will not take risks. Private people will not invest. Private people will not commit to building organizations in India. Parents will not commit to having their kids live in India. People will not commit to building organizations in India if there is an environment where one can be expropriated, if there is an environment where a business model can be capriciously destroyed by a sudden new law or a regulation that appears on some website, if a business can be destroyed by the enforcement agencies. If these kinds of risks are prevalent too much in the economy, then the private sector loses predictability about the working of the state. And it is no longer feasible to go on as we have. So again, when India was a $200 billion economy, you could get away with such things. The private sector was small, firms and organizational complexity was small, the Indian state was small. Every now and then there would be a hiccup, some things would go wrong, but the bourgeoisie had ways of having recourse to the policymakers and solving some problems. None of that works anymore. We have become too big a country, we have become too complex a country. We can't have these idiosyncratic ways of approaching some officer and asking him for help, and that doesn't work anymore. Now we need a deepening of the rule of law. Now we need rule of law. What private people need to see is that there is an impersonal system of rules, and the rules will predictably and consistently be applied to me and to my competitor. Okay? Then and only then you come to an environment where private people will feel safe, will feel confident, will be willing to take risks, will be able to commit to building India.
Two threads, two foundational thoughts run through your book. One is the primacy of private enterprise,
Yeah.
and the other is the role of the government.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about each of them?
Okay.
Because some of these are not very popular.
Yeah. So, primacy of private enterprise, it is crystal clear to us that the dominant force in India is the private sector. Okay. Starting from a one-man vendor selling fruit all the way to the large corporations, almost all GDP is produced by private firms. Almost all jobs are created by private firms. Okay, so every now and then you may get a clamor that to solve the unemployment problem, the government should hire people. I mean, excuse me, the government is a tiny, insignificant player in the labor market. Okay, so the overall size of the Indian labor market is some 400, 500 million people, and the government might at most be employing 10 million people. So the magnitudes are so starkly apart that it emphasizes that the only force that will work in the Indian landscape are private firms. So we should be crystal clear that only the private sector is the force that will create GDP. Okay, now let's think a little more on a global scale. Some countries have achieved prosperity. Okay? Only a few countries were poor in 1945 and have become prosperous liberal democracies today. There are exactly 4 countries that have done it well. They are Israel, Chile, Korea and Taiwan. There are only 4 countries that were actually dirt poor in 1945 just like us, and are today beautiful, amazing, prosperous countries. They are liberal democracies. Okay, so all the success stories of countries that have found their feet, countries that have eliminated mass poverty, all these success stories are market economies. All the success stories are countries which grew on the back of private enterprise. It is only private enterprise that has the energy, the dynamism, the innovation, the creativity, that restless, ceaseless process of looking at the world, seeing what is going wrong, solving problems, innovating, trying things, making mistakes, going bankrupt. Okay, this is the energy, the vitality of the private sector. Only the private sector can do that. Let's never have any illusions. So we should not look to the government to run a business. We should not look to the government to make jobs. Okay, we do need a government. I'm not an anarchist at all. We need a government. There are certain roles that the government has to play, but we should be very clear that the government is a service provider around the fundamental creation of prosperity that is only done by the private sector. The government cannot create prosperity. The government can create conditions in which the private sector can create prosperity. Okay, so in that case, what is the government to do? What is the job of the government? What is the role of government? The economists have a very nice technical conception of what is government. The job of government is to address something called market failure. Market failure is a technical term. It covers 4 kinds of cases. So case 1 is something that is called a public good. A public good is one where everybody is the beneficiary, where your consumption of the public good in no way diminishes my consumption of the public good, and you cannot even in principle deny a newborn child the benefit of the public good. And the greatest example of a public good is safety. Okay? Only the government can keep us safe from an invasion by a foreign country. Only a government can create a criminal justice system that will keep us safe from criminals. Only a government can keep my property safe. Only a government can keep my life safe. So that's a public good. Only the government can do that. Clean air is a public good. Only the government can run a regulatory system through which air is clean. When you breathe clean air, in no way does that diminish the amount of clean air that I can breathe. And we cannot even in theory exclude a newborn child from the consumption of clean air. That's a public good. Only the government can do public goods. Okay? The second role of the government is to fight monopolies. Every now and then a private industry gets locked into the domination of just a handful of players who achieve supernormal profits. That's not a healthy situation for society, and you need a government that will disrupt monopolies. Unfortunately, in India, many times the government creates monopolies, and that's equally harmful, if not worse. The third problem that a government is useful in solving are problems of asymmetric information. I go to a shop, I buy medicines. It's not reasonable for a household to understand when the medicine is fake. Okay, so if a medicine is adulterated, it is impossible for a buyer to understand. If I buy a strip of amoxicillin, am I going to send 2 of the tablets to a lab for testing? That's not a reasonable thing for an individual to do. Only the government can run some food and drugs safety system whereby we are assured that the food I'm buying, the drugs I'm buying, I'm a user of a bank. How do I know if a bank is safe? It's very difficult for a household to understand the fragility of a bank. Finally, the last category of the involvement of a government is called externalities. Roughly speaking, where I smoke and you get cancer, and this is not a thing that private people will be able to solve by themselves readily, and you need a government to interfere. So these are the 4 categories of things that are called market failures, and the role of a government is to address market failure. The role of a government is not to be in business. The role of the government is not to do central planning, and we often get asked, how do you define central planning? And the good way to think about central planning is, if ever a government is choosing a technology that private people will use, something is going wrong. So if a government is telling the technician here what kind of engineering standard should be in that camera, or what kind of technical standard should be in this microphone, then you're surely doing something wrong. A government should never be prescribing what technical or engineering standards are being used by society. A government should never be choosing this firm will win or this technology will win. If a government is ever picking winners, then something is going wrong. A government should never favor one industry over another industry, one firm over another firm, one technology over another technology. This is called central planning, and we should keep out of it.
So this is the purpose of the government policy.
And what is the limited toolkit of intervention that you talk?
So very often in India, when we see any problem, we run to the government. We say government is a solution to every problem. We want a government that will solve every problem in society and will wipe every tear. And we think that's just factually incorrect and also philosophically incorrect. If you will permit me, I first want to talk a bit about philosophy. We would argue in favor of a more mature conception of philosophy where unhappiness and sorrow and tragedy are a part of human existence. So we shouldn't rush to the conclusion that every tragedy requires a government to solve it. Okay? Unhappiness and sorrow is a part of human existence. I mean, let us be a little Buddhist about it, and let's be cautious in who we are dragging into our life. The second element of philosophy is that there's a tremendous destruction of social capital that comes when you bring a government into your life. Okay? It would be really great for all of us as human beings if we could talk to each other, if we could work with each other, if we could solve problems. It is always better if we will negotiate, if we will form an association, if we will form a club, if we will solve our problems with each other. Because human beings at the ground level, when we make eye contact with each other, a fundamental decency will always rule. We will always be decent to each other. We will always have a give and take. You will give some, I will give some, we will talk to each other. Our negotiations and our discussions and our compromises will always yield better solutions under local conditions. The government is a violent political creature. A government ultimately is the danda. And once you bring a government into your life, it can easily go bad, it can easily go wrong. The government is a very messy creature. And we should be very cautious before we bring a government into our life. So this is on the philosophy. And if you look back into India, if you look 100 years ago, we were not like this. Okay? We were not running to the government for every problem. I think something happened out of the freedom movement, out of the early paradigm of development of Nehru and Mahalanobis, where we started thinking the government is everything. The government is a leader. The government will guide India. The government will shape India. The government will solve every problem. The government is some nice NGO. I think we should push back against all those conceptions. The government is defined both by Max Weber and by Gandhiji as a community that achieves the monopoly of physical violence in a given territory. Okay, this is the definition of what is a state. Let me restate the definition. What is the state? The state is a community that achieves and maintains a monopoly on physical force in a given territory. The heart and soul of the government is violence. The heart and soul of a government is physical force. That's what a government does. It says, you cannot beat me and I cannot beat you, but a government can beat me. Okay, so that is government. Let's understand, it's an ugly, horrible thing. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not saying we should not have a government, but let's have no illusions about what a violent creature can do to you. Let's use him as little as we can. And so that leads to the toolkit of intervention. What can a government do? Case 1, a government can say, I shall prohibit you from certain kinds of behavior. And if you don't obey, then I will inflict violence upon you. Okay, I'll put you in jail, I'll do some terrible things to you. Okay, so they can say, maybe you can only drive on the left side of the road. Maybe if you're a factory, you cannot emit certain pollution. Okay, various prohibitions on behavior can be enacted by the government, and that is one element of the toolkit of intervention to aim to regulate or modulate or modify human behavior. This is category 1. Then category 2, the government can say, I need you to give me money. That is taxation. Once again, let us not mistake the violence that is present inside taxation. The government says, you have no choice, you have to pay me tax. And if you don't pay me tax, I will put you in jail. Okay? So there's nothing nice or kind or polite about taxation. Taxation is born of violence. Taxation is extracting money from people by threatening them with violence. So that is case 2, that a government can tax us. It can extract money from us. Nobody wants to willingly pay taxes. Okay? And case 3, the government can spend that money. Okay? That's all. A government can do an expenditure program which is also tainted with violence because taxation is born of violence. A government can take money from the people through taxation, and the government can enact rules that demand us to modify our behavior and threaten us with violence when we refuse to comply. That is government. There is no more, there is no less. That is all there is to government. The government is not some nice NGO. Okay, so I love the stories that you and Vikram were telling me earlier today about your activities, but all that wonderful thing can only be done by a private person. Private philanthropy is a fundamentally altruistic project. A government is not an altruistic project. A government is a violent project. We should recognize the violence that lies at the core of government, and there's a beautiful quote by Gandhiji in the book to this effect.
May I read that?
Yeah.
The individual has a soul, but the state is a soulless machine. The state can never be weaned away from violence to which it owes its existence. I had read it earlier, but it's only now that I understand how deep misunderstanding of the universe was.
And if I may just point out, Gandhiji was right. They said about the same time that Max Weber, the great German philosopher, is credited with the famous definition of state. So, if you study political science anywhere in the world, people will always say Max Weber invented this sentence that the state is a community that achieves and maintains a monopoly on the physical force in a given territory. Everybody credits this to Max Weber, but actually Gandhiji was right there. He was thinking those same things at that time.
Yeah. But then talk of Nehru and Mahatma. You think they made these big mistakes at the time of independence?
We should be cautious when judging people in a different age. Okay, so I don't want to sit in a time machine and judge what Nehru and Mahatma were thinking. That India was different. Just to say this to you, Vijay Kelkar and I have profound debates on this subject. I am more negative about Mahalanobis and Nehru on what they did on the economy. Kelkar says, no, if you were there in 1947, you would be agreeing with a lot of that. There was merit to what they were doing at that time. And clearly it worked in some ways because starting from 1947, there was a significant surge in Indian growth as compared to what it was in the previous 50 years. So for some years it worked reasonably well. By the 60s, this petered out. So roughly speaking, at the China War, India got into a terrible crisis of growth, which lasted all the way to 77. So in a way, India got a good period from 47 to 62, and then a bad period from 62 to 77.
Wonderful. Your third part in the introductory part of the book is about diagnosing the Indian experience. And this is under multiple aspects. you're talking of anatomy of our policy failures. You have a wonderful chapter called Why Do Things Go Wrong? And in that, I particularly like this whole concept of marginal cost of public funds. I think you should talk about some of these.
So, we and I are very worried that to most of us in India, we have a very happy conception of the Indian state. Okay, so there is some schizophrenia in our heads. Okay, all of us simultaneously hold two violently incompatible beliefs. Okay, on one hand, we think, oh my God, the government, it's deaf, dumb, blind, evil. Okay, so, and on the other hand, we will always run to the government should do this and the government should do that. Okay, so I mean, let's resolve this schizophrenia. So we would like to, so in the book, we remind all of us that what is the Indian state? The Indian state is an organization that is unable to do some basics right, and let's constantly remind ourselves of these elementary failures. Okay, and you've seen in the book we have many of them. For example, we know that about half of school teachers who are civil servants do not show up to teach. Okay, just imagine how bad that is. That is so absolutely basic. There's a person who's being paid a salary as a civil servant to teach school kids in a government school, and roughly speaking, the number in India is half. That about half the days they don't show up to teach, and we, the Indian state, are unable to solve these basic HR and management problems. And it's been going on forever. It's not new. It's been going on for 30-40 years. This kind of data and statistics is now known, and we don't seem to ever fix it. Okay. Similarly, it is absolutely shocking to understand that the immunization coverage of kids in India has actually been going down, not up, for the last 25 years. Okay. We think we're getting better. No, things are actually getting worse. We are doing less well at immunizing the kids of India through the government health machinery than we used to 25 years ago. Okay. This is failing, it's not working. Similarly, in Hyderabad you are blessed, but all of you are aware that North India today is one of the world's hotspots of an air quality crisis. Okay. The air quality in North India is an absolute disaster. People are smoking 50 cigarettes a day by just living in North India. That is exerting a tremendous impact upon the lives of people, upon health, upon longevity, upon the intellectual development of children, okay, and so on. The effects go on, and we just don't seem to be able to do anything about that. It's been years and years. Every year we have a crisis. We get the reporting about the PM 2.5. I sometimes wonder whether the meters that are being put in are able to report readings about 999, because some of the meters max out at 999, and 999 is an absolutely appalling, this is 999 micrograms per cubic meter of particles of a size below 2.5 microns. It is absolutely appalling state of air quality, and we don't seem to be able to fix it. Okay, or think of safety. Safety is the most fundamental public good, and you know, what is the state of safety in India? What is the state of safety in North India? Are young women safe walking around this country? Are young women safe when walking around in North India? We don't seem to succeed on these basics. Or look at our courts. There are case backlogs running 5 years, 10 years. I could go on and on. So I think it is important to recognize that it's broke. Okay? We should not go on with the illusion that the Indian state works well. We seem to have some very positive, glossy spin that is being put all the time. Every time a government comes out with a great deal of optimism, announces we will do this, and all of us applaud, and all of us, we seem to be willing to suspend our disbelief, and we think, now this time this one is going to work. Why? Okay, we should be more skeptical. We should understand the anatomy of policy failure. We should think deeply about why all these things have failed, because that will help guide us to design better policies in the future. But we should come into this from a stance of fundamental skepticism. And this is really something all of us should be doing much more of. What is happening too often is we are all ready to buy into the next dream that is being offered to us by a local government, by a state government, by a union government, where we say, no, this time, now this government initiative is going to work. Why? Because you have not solved the fundamental foundations. There are basic reasons why this thing is broken. Okay, so as you said, we offer some diagnosis. We have chapters about understanding why this thing fails. Okay, and so let's go deeper. Let's not stop at this closed form, the black box conception that it's broken. Let's go deeper and understand why does it fail. And it takes you to many issues. There is an administrative constraint, there's a resourcing constraint. There's a very important pillar of thought in political science and economics, which is called public choice theory. Public choice theory is a very simple and grand idea. It says that the individuals who make up the state, whether they are officials or politicians or whoever, the individuals are self-interested. That's all. It's a simple, powerful idea that don't model the officials and politicians as benevolent. Don't model officials and politicians as Gandhiji and Nehru. Okay, that age is gone. Model officials and politicians as regular people just like you and me, who are motivated by practical life considerations of getting ahead in life and doing well for themselves, and then think about how the behavior of politicians and officials will work out. So we do wrong over and over because we have some rosy conception that politicians and officials are benign, benevolent, good people, and that makes us anticipate their behavior in a wrong way. Similarly, let's think about the financing constraint. You brought up this issue of the marginal cost of public funds. We are very comfortable in India about proposing spending public money. Okay, so each of us has 5 pet programs where we will be very happy if more money is spent on X. Okay, and there are undoubtedly some areas where money needs to be spent to a greater extent. But we should think more about where that money comes from. That money comes from taxation. Okay, so let's think for a moment. There's 1 rupee in my pocket. The taxman comes, he takes away that 1 rupee. That 1 rupee is worth 1 rupee. It seems like 1 rupee is 1 rupee. Actually, that's not how the world works. So what happens is that the moment you announce a certain kind of taxation, now all of us will change our behavior. We will distort our behavior so as to avoid taxation. Okay? It is fundamental to human nature that if you say that kerosene is taxed and petrol is not, then we will start designing and adapting our cars to use kerosene and avoid petrol. Okay? Now all that hard work that goes in tinkering with our engines to make them consume kerosene is just a waste. It's a cost to society that people are devoting time and effort and buying hardware to make a car run on kerosene. Why did you do all that? Because the government changed some taxes. Okay? Now it is a waste of time and money to do these adaptations. So that's a cost to society. Okay? Similarly, there's a cost to society because of the compliance cost. All of us, we have to keep records, we have to submit tax filings. Okay? You have all experienced the GST. We put time, effort. We have to hire people like Ajay Gandhi to help us achieve compliance with GST. Okay? In an ideal world, we would need less of those services. You know? So we should all be doing productive things. We should be making goods and services that people want. Instead, we end up producing goods and services that are just part of worshipping the Indian state and not actually doing a productive activity. Okay? And then of course finally there is the dark side of the tax system, which is the corruption, which is the raids, which is the enforcement actions, which is the litigation, and there's a whole litany of woe that goes with the machinery of the enforcement. So we should think that 1 rupee of taxes does not come at a cost of 1 rupee to society. It actually costs more than 1 rupee to society. So there's a very powerful concept in economics which roughly speaking says that what is the cost to the country? How much is the decline in GDP that goes with 1 rupee of expenditure of the government? And in the book Kelkar and I, we hazard a guess for the number. We think that it's about 3, which means that for each 1 rupee that a government spends, it's coming at a cost to society of 3 rupees. Okay? So we should think about it and we should decide certain areas, a few areas, there is very high gains to society by having a government in the picture, and that's where you should spend. But for the rest, we should be very frugal, we should be very modest, spend frugally, spend rarely, think 5 times before promising to spend government money. So if you think of the fundamental foundational work of a government, safety, police, judiciary, the tax administration and tax policy itself, macroeconomic and financial stability, dealing with the new coronavirus, COVID-19. Okay, there are fundamental things where 1 rupee spent by the government can deliver gains to society of more than rupees 3. That's why we should do government. If we are not convinced that there is such a large gain, then we should not do government.
In the context of public choice theory, you write this: we will not build the republic by finding benevolent people. The objective of reform is not to hire saints, but to achieve a state which yields good outcomes when each actor is self-interested.
Yeah, so every now and then we get this theory. I want to unflinchingly use the word theory. Okay, so everything you do in the world of politics and economics and public policy is based on a theory about the world. You have a theory that the source of India's poverty and backwardness is X, and therefore when I change X, I think things will improve. Okay, so this is not a field for practical people. This is a field for dreamers. Okay, to do politics and to do economics and to do public policy is about theorizing. So every now and then we hear a theory that everything is fine and you just need to get some good people. Okay, so let's hire some good people and our systems, our procedures will work better.
Benevolent dictator.
Yeah, that we want benevolent people, we want good people, we want a Ram Rajya, and you just have to find Mr. Ram, and for the rest we are fine, it's good. And we would profoundly disagree. Great countries do not build states that are built out of benevolent people. Great countries build states which have regular guys just like you and me who are manning the machinery of the state. It is about incentives, it is about information, it is about checks and balances that produces better behavior by those same people. Okay, so for example, if you are running an organization, okay, yes, you will try to hire good people, but fundamentally you won't build a 500-man organization out of trusting that every single one is a saint. You will create checks and balances, you will create systems, you will create incentive mechanisms whereby each person has the self-interest of working hard towards goals that are compatible with the goals of the organization. That is the pathway to building organizational capability. I'd like to tell a little story. Once when I was in Paris, I was mugged and my cell phone was stolen. Okay, so because I am an economist, I did not leave it at that. I went to the police station, I filed a complaint just to experience and discover what are the institutions of a first world country. And I was struck by the glory and wonder of how well a police station in Paris works. Okay, and I could go on and on telling you the story about how well the police station works. But the most important point I would make is, it is not that the policeman is a better human being than the policeman in Hyderabad. We are all regular guys, we are all human beings. If the policeman in Hyderabad behaves less well, it is because that person is presented with different incentives. And our job is to change those incentives. It is the structure of information, rules, incentives that shapes the working and behavior of every official and every politician. And to build the republic, that is what we have to solve. Let's not have this idea that we'll get a better person.
And before we move on to the science, there is one more aspect of your writing which I thought was worth discussing, and that is the issue of state capacity.
So state capacity is this idea that we have a government that is not, to use an American phrase, we have a government that is not able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So this is the government that trips over and falls when it tries to do elementary things. Okay, so state capacity is the ability to name a problem, establish a management structure, resource it, and go succeed, go score victory, and solve the problem that you set out to attack. Okay? And that's not where we are. We have low state capacity. So the heart and soul of the Indian problem is to recognize that we have low state capacity. Every now and then, when a government says that I will do X, we are actually going to flounder and fail. And let's wake up and smell the coffee. This is a very low capability state. And our job is to change that. So everything we do has to be designed around the problem of recognizing that there is low state capability. State capacity is something that a country learns. So every country learns how to be a state. Okay? And again, I want to use examples that all of us have experienced. We have all been in organizations. We have all seen the expansion and complexity of organizations. And this is something you learn. There's a learning by doing. That we have all experienced 5-man, 10-man, idiosyncratic moment of organizations. And then you scale up, you become a complex organization. You establish formal processes. How do you run the finance function? How do you run the HR function? One by one, we learn these capabilities. And that should be how we think about this. That in the Indian state, we need to learn the basics of how to be a state, how to achieve capability. And that requires narrowing down to a few things, recognizing that by default we don't know how to do that, and embarking on that process of discovering how to do public administration, how to do political science, how to do politics, how to bring complex abstract ideas through which we will rethink the working of these organizations. Take a few areas and succeed, because then tomorrow we will be able to apply those lessons into other areas.
When you were talking of incentives and the mindsets, this is a quote that I loved. A government organization that is riven with corruption is not one which was unlucky to get a lot of corrupt people. It is one where the rules of game facilitate corruption. Conversely, when the rules of the game are changed, this will generate changes in the utmost entrenched mindset, in the utmost established organization.
So I want to tell a story. There is a old master in Indian public policy whose name is Percy Mistry. Percy Mistry is a remarkable person who has, for example, played a role in the Indian 1991 IMF World Bank program and so on. I used to complain about the mindset of regulators in India in the 1990s. And Percy Mistry would always tell me to shut up. He used to say, people are the same everywhere. There is no such thing as mindset. Mindset is only because of the rules of the game. It is because there are rules that facilitate arbitrary power. There are rules that facilitate central planning. It is the rules that create the behavior of the individuals inside an organization. So there is no such thing as mindset. Mindset is endogenous to rules. So similarly, it's not that the policeman in Paris is a better human being than the policeman in Hyderabad. There's no such thing that this organization has a good culture or a bad culture. That culture is because of rules, and our job is to change those rules. Change the laws, change the process manuals, change the accountability mechanisms, take away arbitrary power, create checks and balances, and then those same individuals will behave
differently.
His book is divided into 4 large parts. One was the art of policy making, and we have just about finished the art. Now then there is the science of policy making. If I continue with all of that, it's going to take another 1 hour. I would ask you to pick up 4 or 5 important concepts and take them. I think that makes a lot more sense than...
Many people have been a little confused. What are these words, art and science? And so we have admittedly had poetic license in the use of these words. We think of science
as the material where we are pretty convinced. When I say we, I mean the intellectual community, where we are reasonably convinced that this is true beyond all reasonable doubt. Okay, so if I may say it differently, okay, so you will read chapter 5 and you will say, no, I don't agree with you. Okay, you're claiming it is science. No, I don't agree with you. I am claiming that if you will give me half day of your life and you'll sit with me and I will talk with you, I will persuade you, I will show you the logic. Many times we have nice clean mathematical demonstrations of certain phenomena, and I'll be able to show you the evidence, and at the end of that there's a 90-95% chance that you will get convinced. Okay, so we don't show all the evidence, we don't show all the arguments, but we're standing on 100 years of knowledge on the chapters in the science part, and really there is no doubt that these things are true. In contrast, when there is the art part, we pose certain questions, we think they're very important questions, we think that all of us as citizens of this country should ponder those questions and develop a point of view about those questions. We have our opinions, we write our opinions, but we are advertising to you that, you know, this is the art. So you're welcome to disagree with us. If you feel persuaded, great. You feel differently, great. Okay? So this is the subject of healthy discussion and debate and disagreement, and each of us, we have to ponder these questions. They are very important questions, and we don't pretend that we have figured it out. We recognize that reasonable people can disagree on these questions. So that's our distinguishing between the art and science. So on the science, you know, we're very confident that we know this stuff. When I say we, I mean it's 100 years of political science and economics through which these concepts have been developed. They are battle tested across the whole world. There is ample knowledge in India and abroad, and really there is no doubt that these facts are true. That's the distinction between the art and the science. What are some sweet ideas under the science that we think that we would push? There's some great stuff in economics that I think needs to be reiterated every now and then. We've already talked about incentives. Okay, simple, blinding, powerful idea. People respond to incentives. Okay, everything that you do about government, you have to think that when the government does something, the people will not stay fixed. Okay, people will change their behavior in response to whatever the government does. So if the government says that this is the way taxation will be done, people will change their behavior to respond to that taxation, and we will all call it tax planning, we will call it tax optimization. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing unethical or illegal about that. We have an example in the book. Long ago in Amsterdam, taxes were collected in proportion to the width of the house. Okay, so the idea was that if your house is wider, you're probably richer, so we'll charge you more taxes. Very well then, people built houses. The narrowest houses in Amsterdam are 80 centimeters wide. So an entire house is built, it's a palace that is built, but it's just 80 centimeters wide. Okay, people respond to incentives. You change some rules, people will not be fixed. So, you know, we are not brick, we are not stones, but we are men. And being men, we will optimize, we will not stand still. So it's a simple, powerful idea. Similarly, we have material on the price system. This is very basic stuff, that if there is a price of gold in Hyderabad and there's a price of gold in Bombay, and the two prices are slightly different, then of course people are going to buy the cheaper one and sell at the costly one. Okay, this is called arbitrage. And every now and then policymakers don't seem to understand this, and they seem to think that arbitrage is somehow a bad thing. This is just basic, that's how markets work, that you will buy where it is cheap and you will sell where it is costly. That is called arbitrage. It's something that all human beings will try to do. You should not be surprised when people do it. Okay, when you try to force a price down, there will be less supply. Okay, a government that gets angry that some price is too high, and if a government tries to artificially distort the price, well, then the supply will be spoiled because people will not sell at that lower price. So these are very simple, powerful things, but they are worth thinking about, and they have big implications. So Kelkar always says that he gets amused at how over and over, whether it is the legislature or the executive or the judiciary, in India we make mistakes on these basics. He always jokes about policymakers who try to control the price and the quantity. You can't. I mean, the market system has its own logic. It will find the price. You can't control the price and the quantity.
There was a nice chapter on evolutionary changes for society and revolutionary changes for God.
Again, under the art, these are rich and interesting concepts, and this is where we really profoundly disagree with Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay, so Nehru's conception was that he was in a hurry. If you asked him, he would say in 50 years, India will become like England. Okay, so England was the frontier, and his dream was very clear. In 50 years, we're standing in 1947, by 2000 AD, India will match England. So he was in a hurry to do many things, and he was a dreamer, he was a visionary. He had a design of society, and he tried to impose that design upon society. Okay, and we disagree profoundly. We think that's a bad way to work for so many reasons. First, because the age of Nehru is gone. We no longer have people like Nehru anymore. And when some powerful people will impose a vision upon society, it may not always be good. It may not always be in the best interests of the citizenry. conceptually, philosophically, it is better to move incrementally. So all of us, we know our world best. So we always take a very distributed and decentralized view of society. India is a vast country. We are 3.3 million square kilometers. Each location is different. People should look at their world and make progress in their world and incrementally keep changing the world. So don't have a French Revolution. Don't try to disruptively change things. Make progress incrementally. Keep talking, keep debating, keep negotiating, and keep making progress incrementally. And different parts of the country will evolve in different ways, and that's perfectly okay. So again, this is thinking in a very decentralized way. We don't like one single Indian national anything. Okay? India is like a European Union. There are different regions of India have their own logic and should evolve based on the imagination and values and preferences of the different people. So what works in one small part of India may not work in another small part of India. Each one should have its own logic. So we dream of a world where all of us, we have some energy, we have some consciousness, we are all part of a political system, we are all part of politics, and we are incrementally problem solving in our little locale. So we keep evolutionarily improving things, we make progress, but there is no attempt at central planning. That there is no great leader who knows what the destination is, will lead you to your glorious destination. Let's not think like that. We the people should control our destiny. We the people should be looking at our world, making progress. So think in a very distributed, decentralized way. Think of communities, think of villages, think of cities, think of each of us trying to look, trying to talk, trying to debate, trying to argue, trying to incrementally make progress. And I think that's a better way to proceed.
Gandhi again.
Once again, Gandhiji was ahead of all of us in so many ways. I did a talk recently on a modern view of Gandhiji's economics, and I think 100 years later we are going to see Gandhiji in a much more positive light.
I'll just take one or two and then move on to, I'm sure you'll have 100 questions waiting there. One
Is your chapter which says this is a test match and not an IP. So again, every now and then we meet
People who have two visions. One vision is that you want some one powerful person who is benevolent and brilliant and intelligent and is a genius and will execute one big policy change, and then all our problems will be solved. Okay? And there are two problems in this vision. The first is that anybody knows the answer. Okay? And the second is that there is some single dictator who is benevolent, who is powerful, or one powerful bureaucrat or one powerful politician. We personalize it. We want one great man who will solve our problems. And this is just wrong. This is not how the world works. To make progress in any field, you have to settle in for long periods of time. So we always say test match, not an IPL. Don't play for 20 overs. We also use an analogy from mountaineering, which is of a siege style assault versus an alpine style assault. In an alpine style assault, Ajay Gandhi and I will put on our backpacks and in 2 days we'll run up Mount Everest. Okay? Or we'll die trying. Okay? In a siege style assault, first 100 people will go build base camp. Then 50 people will go build camp 1 and so on. We'll slowly build an entire infrastructure. There'll be large teams that are in the picture. We will carry supplies, we'll carry resources. So we think that is a better scalable, sustainable foundation for doing policy that actually works. Because if you just have 1 or 2 people, tomorrow they are gone and the whole thing falls apart. What you need, the areas of India where we have made progress, where the process of change works, is a field where there is a large community, where many people are involved, where many people take interest, where there is argument and debate and the development of a consensus, and then we start moving one thing at a time, and over long periods we achieve great change. So we should not become cynical that because progress is difficult, nothing will ever change. That's simply not true. If you're able to chip away for 20 years, making many small changes, you could change a lot, and it will actually be a better outcome because you've incrementally learned along the way. You try something, it works, it doesn't work, you change course. We should be very humble. We should admit that we don't know. And that doesn't mean you should do nothing. You should admit that we don't know, we're doing an experiment, let's try something. If it works well, we'll go further. If it doesn't work, we'll roll back. There's no pride in saying that I was wrong. I mean, let's admit that we were wrong. Let's constantly gather data, let's gather evidence. Let's be reasonable and modest with each other. So in public policy, we should not puff up our shoulders and claim I am some great hero and I know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. Okay? Instead, let's just say, look, let's sit together, let's negotiate, let's debate, and let's make a move. Let's set up measurement systems. Let's think what works, what doesn't work, and then maybe we'll change something, and then we'll keep moving. And over 20 years, you can achieve transformative change.
I'll take just 3 issues and then we'll open it up. One was the phenomenal act that was done in India of demonetization. It's against every ethics of every standard of governance that we talk about. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, so there are some principles that we worry about where this does not pass muster. Okay? So one principle, don't do big things. Okay? So this classifies as a big thing. Because big things you can go wrong, we can make big mistakes. So, our fundamental methodological skepticism says don't do big things, do small things. Then the concept that there is a great problem called corruption and there will be one silver bullet. We don't agree. There is never a silver bullet. All great complex problems require great complex remedies. So there is indeed a problem of corruption. It's a rich, complex problem, and it requires many, many things to change. And by the way, at the Indian level of per capita income expressed in PPP dollars, it is not true that either corruption or tax evasion in India is out of line with other countries. India is about okay compared to other countries of the Indian level of per capita GDP in terms of either the amount of tax or the amount of corruption. So it's not true that there is a great crisis for corruption. And even if there was, there will never be a silver bullet. So we will always be skeptical about any one silver bullet. Complex social problems are never solved by any one silver bullet. Then we are instinctively uncomfortable with the secrecy. If you keep something secret, you suddenly spring it upon everybody. This is not a good way to do policy. And you remember in the book, there is a principle which we talk about, which actually comes from a great man called James C. Scott. He says, do things that you can undo. A fundamental principle of public policy should be that we will try to do something and there is a decent chance that we are wrong. And then when we realize that we are wrong, we will roll back because we were wrong. There's no pride in saying that I was wrong. Let's admit, most of the time we are wrong. We don't know. We don't know enough about the world to do public policy correct. And by its very design, demonetization is a kind of measure that is difficult to roll back. So even if later on you realize that you're wrong, you won't be able to roll back. You should be very cautious about doing things which you can't undo.
I remember 2 things which I had got. One is you have given a roadmap on drafting laws. I think we need to discuss that, and also of policy.
So very often in India we hear the claim that in India we have great laws, but they are badly enforced. Okay? So agree? You would have heard this hundreds of times. We profoundly disagree. We think that a law that is susceptible to bad implementation is a bad law. Okay? Implementation should be high on your mind when you're drafting a law. So while drafting the law, when you're giving some official some
power, you have to think about the checks and balances, because otherwise that individual will abuse those powers. So right there, while designing laws, we should be thinking deeply about the public administration framework. You're setting up a government agency. What will be the board? What will be the checks and balances? How will you prevent individuals inside the government agency from exercising arbitrary power, from doing bad things to the persons that they command power on? And you need hundreds of sections in the law that do this check and balance. And when you don't have this check and balance, you're guaranteed to have policy failure, because you're then being optimistic that there are some saints who are going to operate the coercive power of the state. This is a very brief paragraph which summarizes this. For those of you who take interest in law and the drafting of law, I'm happy to talk with you further. There's a chapter on this in the book. Maybe you might like to read that.
Yes. One aspect, great manual to change the society. How do they go about it?
Our highest dream for this book is that people like all of you who have taken the trouble to come here in the evening and spend 1 or 2 hours of your life on Manthan. Okay? This is the community that matters above all. It is we the people. We need to think, we need to debate, we need to argue, we need to change the culture, we need to start demanding more out of politics and economics in India. If enough of us will read, will think, will debate, then we will get a better India.
I just wanted to say that this is a giant challenge that is facing all of us as a people, and the most important tool is social isolation, which is a fancy word for let's not do large gatherings of people where we touch each other and we talk in each other's face, and where one person sneezes in a closed room and it spreads to other people. So all of us have to come up with extreme measures. We have to avoid weddings. Even if your brother is getting married, you should not attend. Okay? We have to avoid temples, we have to avoid schools, we have to avoid pubs. Okay? For the next 3 months, I think we have to bring a different level of behavior, and it will make all the difference in fighting this.
This is the last Manthan talk, and we will not have something for till the situation says yes, we can now go ahead and do it. So since this was planned, we went ahead with it. Maybe not in March, not in April. Let's see if we are able to do something in May or even later than that.
Well, I read this line of when I read talk I don't know why. And it said that China's ability to implement it over 2 weeks. One is because of their authoritarian regime, and second is, which I found very interesting, is their cultural consciousness of collective responsibility. I find it a very interesting phrase, and I wanted to see that in the light of our own economic policy. So the first question I have to you is that, do we as citizens have a responsibility of collectiveness? And because we don't, that's what our mind. Is it why that some of our policies are failed, and we are individually not conscious of the society, and we are individually have very heightened self-interest, and maybe that is why that some of the policies fail? This is my question number one.
So first on China and the new coronavirus, we should be cautious before we are ready to become happy about the authoritarian regime and its success. In fact, it was the very
fact about an authoritarian regime that information about the scale of the epidemic was kept hidden, and that is what made all the difference. So there is systematic evidence that democracies fare better on epidemics because we don't keep secrets from each other. The most important thing we need in democracy is that openness, that transparency. We should be willing to talk to each other. We should test large numbers of people. We should have honest, open data, and everybody should debate the data. That is the most important weapon for fighting the coronavirus. On your second theme about social cohesion and social capital, once again I would like to go back to some of the old themes of the freedom movement. I feel that it is very, very important for us to do more in terms of communities. So I'm fascinated and I'm charmed and I'm excited that there is a community like this. That, you know, here in Hyderabad, there is a group of people that meets up and is able to take interest in ideas and come back and talk to each other. We should be doing much more as human beings, as private people, as communities. We should be doing communities talking to each other and solving problems rather than turning to the state. So I already talked about Nehru's conception of the state. There was an idea at the end of the freedom movement that the state will become very powerful and there will be a developmental state. And today I think it is increasingly clear that that did not work so well. We took a colonial state, there was a lack of checks and balances, all kinds of arbitrary powers are there with some government agency or the other, and that has actually damaged our social capital, because when you and I have a problem with each other, both of us will run to the government, whereas actually we should be talking to each other, we should make eye contact, we should negotiate, we should compromise, we should develop trust capital with each other. So it will be a much better India if we will deepen our communities around us and our conversations, our little worlds where we talk to each other and we solve problems, rather than running to the big stick that is the violence of the state.
Yeah, if you notice that collectively none of us have sneezed in the last 1 hour. So we are conscious in it.
Yeah.
The second question I have is that you on subsidies. You gave us that an equation of 1:3. So how do you see the government program of subsidies, some of the common subsidies, for like Manrega, in the context of 1:3?
All governments do certain transfers. For example, if there is a great earthquake and the National Disaster Management Authority will deliver food packets to all of us because our houses have been destroyed in the earthquake, that is a transfer. All of us will morally agree that that transfer is an entirely good thing. So we're not saying that you should not do redistribution. We're saying please weigh the costs. So when you spend that 1 rupee, please think that India's GDP is going down by 3 rupees. Now, if you're convinced that this is a really great application, by all means do it. What we object to is the idea in Indian public policy and in the behavior and the body language of the Indian state that money is free and we just roll out schemes after schemes after schemes. The basic DNA of the Indian state has become, let's run more schemes. We think that's a problem. You really need to refocus the state away from schemes to market failure.
Yeah. Hi. Always very fascinating to hear economics talk, and very bold and profound ideas that I've got over here. So just a few questions, because there are of course a lot of questions, but I'll just limit to 5. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on private enterprises versus government that you mentioned, right? Because while you were speaking, I got a sense that you're more of a proponent for free market theory that was advocated by Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, right? And again in the 60s and 70s, a very famous economist, Milton Friedman, he said that the sole purpose of the corporate is to maximize profits and to maximize shareholder value, right? And that's how private enterprises work and function in any given market. But then now it's changing times. So businesses are becoming more responsible, and at least consumer awareness is becoming much more profound, which are challenging businesses to be more environment friendly, be more climate friendly. The whole ESG index coming into picture. And again, I mean, when we talk about government function, there are a few sectors where government needs to play an active role and just leave all the sectors for the private companies to make them look good, right? I mean, notable ones are environment again. So if the government doesn't have an active role, then you have unchecked degradation of environment. And then again, education, right? So human capital, demographic dividend, and so on. So healthcare system. So we have metrics which says that 5 million children in India do not celebrate 6th birthday, right? And then there are so many infant mortality cases and so many other things. I mean, the Economist publishes these periodic reports of the healthcare system in India, and we have all the metrics. Like we have 80 doctors per 1,000 people, whereas China has 160 doctors per 1,000 people, right? And again, poverty eradication. So we know. So as Ajay Gandhi has mentioned, that 25 crore people were lifted out of poverty due to various government schemes like Manrega. So again, in light of all these things, so I just wanted to check your view on private enterprise versus government, and because there are few sectors where government needs to take an active interest, an active role, and set the right foundation and principles. And again, in the same line of
I think he got it.
Public, okay.
So I did not say that there should be no government. In fact, twice I said that I'm not an anarchist. We need a state. Why do you need a state? Because there are things called market failure, and we do need to build government capacity in areas where there are market failures. And when you see the book, you will find many areas where there is market failure. I will, however, add that a large proportion of what the Indian state does is not connected with market failure, and there is really very poor justification for doing those things, that India will benefit from a significant reduction in the activities of the Indian government. 350 million people were taken out of poverty in the 1990s. It was not at all done by the state. It was done by the market. It was economic growth that did it. Growth is the only pathway to poverty reduction. There is no country that got rich because the government ran poverty schemes. The only countries that ever eliminated poverty got there because they got growth, and all growth is only made by private firms. So let's make no mistake about it, that the only pathway for India is to have a vibrant private sector where firms steadily achieve greater and greater efficiency and productivity and global competitiveness, and that will drive GDP growth in India, and then the average GDP of India will go up, and then poverty will go away. So don't have any illusions about how we're going to make progress in India. The role for the state is to create conditions for the private sector to create wealth. The government will never create wealth.
Thank you for the enlightening and thought-provoking session. It's a great debate. So you mentioned about state capacity, and current government state capacity is the lowest. So we have seen many governments and prime ministers. Which region, right? Which government, which prime minister, and the state capacity was the best, and what was the reason for that?
No, that's not how we would think about it. State capacity is about the functioning of the government institution. Don't think of individuals. Okay, so the Hyderabad police is the Hyderabad police. So you know the police commissioner will come and go. There'll be a little bit of fluctuations. One guy is a bit better, one guy is a bit worse. We are interested in the institution, and we think of that institutional capacity of the Indian state, and we worry about that capacity. So we don't want to get into this personalized conception. So it is not about one RBI governor or another RBI governor. It is about the RBI. There are severe gaps in the capability of RBI. Don't personalize it.
Sir, as you said, we should do things which we can control. Right? In that sense, we have demonetization, which was rolled into on 17 November 8, if I am not wrong. There are many bright minds which make policy making. So, what do you think which has gone wrong there? And before that, just preceding to that was GST. Right. And that was a period where there was harvesting. So, don't we, what went wrong when many bright minds are working on policy making?
I want to worry about conception that some bright minds will do policy. The only healthy democracy is one in which all of us make policy. It is we the people that should be on the table debating alternative ideas and rival conceptions, and there should be deep roots of the discussions and the arguments about every field that leads up to policy changes. Don't look for a few benevolent people. Don't look for a few brilliant people. Don't look for great men. Look for well-functioning institutions.
I got a message from someone in the audience that I forgot taking you to the last chapter.
You choose.
Yeah, please. 1 minute. Chapter 40, I forgot taking it. Ajay, just chapter 40.
Oh, okay.
Please.
Okay, so as I said, the book starts in the preface with asking the question, where did we go wrong? In chapter 40, we offer a theory, a story about what went wrong. Our story is basically about government intervention in the economy. All of us have been told a fairy tale that India had some bad socialism, and then in 1991 we did some reforms, and now we are a market economy. Okay, and that's really not true. We are a country where the government is intervening in all parts of the economy all the time, where there is a tremendous interference by politicians and officials in the lives of every firm. Okay, so this is our problem in India today. There is too much business risk. There is risk to business models, because suddenly some rule will change and you may have had a viable business, but suddenly that business becomes unviable because some policy changes, some law changes, some rule changes. There is too much risk of interacting with regulators. The new central planning is now being done by the regulators. So every detail about a technology is controlled by the regulator. The regulators decide which industry will succeed and which industry will fail, which companies will succeed, which business models will succeed. These decisions are now being made inside regulators. It is central planning all over again. In fact, it is a more intrusive central planning than anything that we saw in 1991. So central planning is back. It is alive and well in all the regulators of India. Okay? And then you have the enforcement agencies. You think of tax, you think of ED, you think of SFIO, you think of all the problems that private firms face when dealing with these organizations in a low rule of law environment. Our story is that all this interference in the lives of private people has added up to too much. That private people are saying under these conditions, it's too troublesome, it is too dangerous for me to build and invest in India. So private people are either keeping their money on the side and saying, I'll watch the match, but I don't want to be a participant in the match, or investing abroad or doing all sorts of other things. But the confidence that is required by private people that I will innovate, I will build, I will compete, and I have reasonable assurance that I will not be expropriated by the state, or that suddenly the government will not change some policy that will mess with my life. That confidence has been shaken, and that is why private investment has retreated. That's our chapter 40.
And while we are talking, there is a huge project of social re-engineering that's going on. That will again inhibit investments and private enterprise. What do you say?
Which project?
Hindutva project.
Yeah. So the uncertainty and the conflict that is created around a problem like citizenship will also feed back on the optimism and sense of stability of private persons, and that will adversely affect investment.
Hello. So there is a general talk, it always happens among people, whenever I get to listen, like people say, in our old days things were pretty cheap, now too costly. What do you think? Which kind of economy was best? Is it when things are cheaper, like lots of things very less, or is it today what we see?
When our grandfathers talked about how chai was 5 paisa, we should also ask them what was your income at the time. So in GDP measurement, once you adjust for inflation, we are in an unimaginably good position today compared to what our parents had and our grandparents had. So I have no doubt that net of inflation, we are better off.
So, don't you think that the amount of intervention that government does in our day-to-day lives and business activities and etc. comes as a direct logical extension to democracy in the sense that vote banks and collective groups are given larger say in what the economic policy should be, but they're not the right experts to do it. Like it's like I'm giving an opinion over something I have no knowledge of.
Yeah. In the book, we argue that the most important force at work is public choice theory, is the desire by officials and politicians to command arbitrary power. So they may do it in the name of democracy, but that is really not a fair description. Conversely, we are able to show you many excellent well-functioning democracies where these maladies don't happen. So there is no link between democracy and the problems of GST.
Sir, I would really appreciate your comment on the Scandinavian model, where the government has participated in health and education sectors, and that has really enabled a context for sustainability.
The Scandinavian model is remarkable. There is a lot to like about the Scandinavian model. People abroad do complex debates about whether you want to be a little more extensive in your conception of the state or a little less extensive in your conception of the state. Kelkar and I think that it would be quite wonderful if one day we in India can have those debates. Because today we cannot. Today we do not have that kind of state capability. So if you try to build a more sprawling conception of an Indian state that will do many, many things, it will just fall on its face. So Kaushik Basu has a great line. He talks about libertarianism of necessity versus libertarianism of choice. Okay, so if you have great state capacity, you can have a reasonable debate that do you want the government to do X, Y, Z or not, because actually you have the capability to do it, and then you can have a debate that do you want more human freedom and human initiative, or do you want the state to do one more thing. But here in India, where state capacity is so limited, there's no question that we have to narrow down our state to a very small number of battles and spend 20 years learning how to achieve competence on those battles.
This was a really interesting thing to see the T20 and the
Yes,
Test
to
match
sign,
coming.
so it will take another 10 minutes to sign.
I having played cricket, understand the difference what you have been telling about T20. Now I would like you to maybe elaborate a bit more on the Test match format of cricket, where we have a scheme called Make in India. How long will it take? Like the T20 takes 40 overs in a day, and a Test match takes 360 overs over 5 days. So how do you relate it to Make in India?
I classify, Kelkar and I classify ourselves as skeptics about Make in India. Okay, so it is very easy for Make in India to become protectionism. Okay, so protectionism is the old style 60s, 70s, 80s thing where we would have national champions, where the government would try to protect Indian companies and try to harm foreign companies. And that just is a terrible idea. It's a bad idea. It doesn't work. It worked badly before. It will work badly again. The most sensible, fair thing to do in India is to remove all barriers to globalization. Okay? We should be part of one single global economy. If a firm is to operate in India, it has to compete. If it can't compete, it should stop. Okay? And then we in India will specialize in certain things that we do very well. So maybe we are good at making software and we are bad at making hardware, and the entire Indian hardware industry closed down in the 80s. So we don't get excited about Make in India. I mean, of course, ultimately many things will be made in India. It depends on how the competitive dynamics plays out, and the exchange rate will move. So the important thing is to emphasize a pro-globalization stance, that we are part of the world economy. We should not try to isolate ourselves. India is the greatest beneficiary of integrating into the world economy. We have lived this movie once before. Okay, so Nehru and Mahalanobis were wrong on trying to put up barriers between India and the world. We saw how that story worked out. Through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, we kept removing those barriers and we harnessed such great gains out of that. So we would really urge that you should not be saying things like Make in India. We don't get excited about manufacturing or agriculture or services. The important thing is that private people in India should think, how can I make more money? If you can make more money growing roses and exporting roses, please do so. If you can make more money making software and exporting software, please do so. Manufacturing is just one more thing. There's no deep reason why manufacturing is any better or any worse. It's just one more thing. Let private firms choose. Okay, it is industrial policy picking winners that manufacturing is good and services is bad. Who are we to say? Let private people decide what is viable in India, what makes money in India.
So, firstly, thank you so much for your time. It was a remarkable talk and definitely reading your book. My question was on what the chief economic advisor said before the budget. He said, and I quote, the theme of this economic survey is wealth creation. Only when wealth is created, it can be distributed. I didn't know what to think of it. Your thoughts, please. Thank you.
It is exactly the sort of thing that I've been saying, that only GDP growth can change the wealth and the fortunes of the country. If you like redistribution, that we will tax some people, we'll give money to some other people, very well. If you would like to pursue that course, but you've got to have GDP in the first place. You've got to have wealth in the first place in order to redistribute it. So I agree entirely with that sentiment.
Very interesting talk. Thank you.
couple of things come to mind. I've heard that the Japanese don't believe in giving out loans and they expect the citizens to take care of themselves, etc. Keeping that in mind and coming back to your theory about 1:3, where we spend 1 rupee and cost society or the country or GDP 3 rupees. What are the repercussions when we cancel these loans that are taken by farmers, the scams that are taking place in the government, the various expenses that we give away for, let's say, marriage of a child, like in Telangana or in Andhra, our child gets married and we give, 1 lakh rupees to the parents to get them married. It's like, we are paying for them to get married. Or for somebody to go for having a puja like Modi did in Varanasi. Huge amount of expense. The Hajj pilgrimage getting different discounts, etc. What are the repercussions of that on the GDP and the economy? Is that necessary, and is that a burden that a normal citizen should take at the expense of the government promoting themselves just to get a vote bank?
So I'll just say 2 simple things. The first, as you already noted, that we should view public money as a very, very weighty expenditure decision. That if I spend money of my own pocket and I spend 1 rupee, I can approach it in a certain casual manner. But when you spend public money is far more weighty, because to spend 1 rupee is to actually impose a cost of 3 rupees upon society, and we should be very, very careful before ever deciding to spend public money. Second, there is an opportunity cost problem. You could be spending public money on actually doing market failure. You could be spending public money on the police. You could be spending public money on the judiciary. You could be spending public money to fight the air quality crisis of North India. Finally, every rupee has an alternative use. And now that is what democracy has to do. Democracy has to produce those debates, the criticism, and finally it is the job of liberal democracy and the parliament or the legislature to choose how you want to spend public money. Okay, so I have shown you one extreme example, that if there is an earthquake here in Hyderabad and the National Disaster Management Agency is giving food packets to you and me, we will agree that's a good use of public money for a transfer program. Okay, most of us will agree that morally, yeah, it may cost 3 rupees for every rupee, but that's a good use in that situation. Under those circumstances, it is a good thing for a government to run a transfer program. At the other extreme, many of the examples that you cited clearly sound ridiculous. What we need in India is a better debate. We need a better consciousness about what is the role of the state, what is the conception of what we want a government to do, what is the cost of public money, and Kelkar and I have offered this book towards that conception of, can we debate between ourselves of what we think is the role of the state.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for the talk. My question is, defense sector is called as white elephant, but still we spend a lot on defense sector. And I understand that security is very important for the country, and having safe borders is very much important. And my question is, this spending 1 rupee, having a 3 rupees value, is it applicable?
Yeah, it is definitely applicable for any government funding. In the book, we talk about one of the areas of where things go wrong. I do not know anything about defense, but I know one thing, that there is a lot of secrecy. Right? So what happens inside the defense establishment, you really don't know. There's not enough data coming out in public domain. You can't easily ask parliament questions and so on. So that's a guarantee that there will be lower quality of use of money in the defense establishment.
Despite the presence of government, there is increasing contrast of wealth and income inequality. If there is rise in the private sector investment, don't you think that this situation will aggravate and there will be impact on the wages?
We don't get excited about inequality. What we would dream is that, can India get rich? That's all. I mean, let's stop fighting about each other.
Is there any question that you have invited in Parliament?
1 minute.
Somebody is asking of defence and expenditure, either opposition parties or these parties, whether to what extent public spending of the expenditure on
Sitaramaya.
defence, even the secret, either any question from the ruling MPs or opposition parties.
I'm not aware of that.
Thank you. Second point is, which I have given it that, whether people like us, intellectuals, besides following, organize and educating, we have to agitate also, as observed by Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Unless and until we agitate other aspect also, do you think that the purpose of our talk will be fulfilled? Whereas organizations like NGOs, other people will agitate also. To what extent you feel my point of thinking is right or wrong? I will sit down, sir. No problem, sir. I'm say 30 years old, 70 years old. If I'm asked to sit, because a good friend of mine is asking me to take rest. Am I clear, sir? People like us, besides organizing, educating, agitation is also, one limb should work. Then my question is very clear there, sir. You can go on like something.
Yeah. I don't have a judgment on that.
You mentioned that there is too
Why?
much
Why photo? I'm not a
too much,
caretaker. You can give me photo later. Thank you.
from the side of the government into the corporate and
Why photo?
private sector. But it seems to me that it is actually a contrary, because there are many instances of fraudulent practices which are taking place in the private and corporate sector. Very few of them have come out, and I'm sure there are a lot more underneath which have not really come out. What do you have to say to this, sir?
To problems of state capacity. So we can surely show you, for example, tax policy and tax administration that works in many other countries, which is far more simple, smooth, hassle-free, frictionless compared to what happens in India. So I think there's no doubt that we are holding a baroque machinery of government and government organizations and government interference as compared to what you see elsewhere in the world. At the same time, we know that the machinery does not work too well, and so we get into these complications. And in building state capacity, a key pathway is to first simplify the work of the state. So think of the state as your contractor. Okay, the contractor has low capability. Don't give him complicated jobs. So come up with very simple objectives, have low objectives, have low aspirations, learn state capability. Can you run a simple single rate GST of 5%? Okay, build it, run it, prove that you have the capability to do it, then think whether you want to do something more complicated. So I think we are prematurely jumping to complex objectives for the Indian state, when the Indian state is fumbling and is unable to do very simple things.
Hello, sir. We talked about how systems respond to different things. So if you look at ISRO, they are performing very well. So what is the difference in incentives with the normal state capacity and ISRO?
So one feature of ISRO is that there is a black and white demonstration of success or failure. Okay, did your craft find an orbit around Mars or not? Did your craft crash into the moon or not? Okay, that's accountability. It's like RBI, is the CPI inflation at 4% or not? That's accountability. Whereas many other government organizations don't have an accountability mechanism. There's no measurement. How do you measure the performance of the Hyderabad police? How do you know that they are winning or losing? How do you know whether the judiciary is working well or is working badly? So that's one thing that worked in the favor of ISRO, that there was a clear definition of success.
No, sir. The Hyderabad police is working better than the Delhi police.
You were speaking about the planning model initiated by Nehru and
Yes. Yes.
But at the time of independence, we are almost, India is just like a baby crawling into the world with limited resources.
So as I said, Vijay Kelkar is much more supportive of the world of Nehru and Mahalanobis, except that today you should not be doing those things.
So that's a time when there is a need for planning the scarce resources for developing the country, because private sector cannot, you cannot imagine private sector to invest in infrastructure projects. Unless infrastructure is ready, private sector will not jump in. So the primary goal at that time was to create infrastructure like building roads, creation of electricity, dams, etc.
That is
what are those people did? Those people
tried to say that if there is aluminium, you cannot use it to make Coke cans. Okay, they were doing central planning. They were not doing infrastructure.
That time, I think lot of, otherwise we would not have this kind of roads also today. Second thing is that now the infrastructure is very much ready. Now you are thinking about encouraging private sector. So all the resources now put into creating better environment for private sector. Then why should we allow the personal taxation to continue? So whatever taxation should come from the private sector itself.
When I say private sector, I mean individuals and firms. So I don't mean to distinguish between the two. I mean the people of India. Everything that is non-government is what I call private.
In between market and state, which is more influential, who influences whom? Next up, what is the national character of India, if at all you feel that we have one?
You should not think of market and state as more powerful and less powerful. The state is essential. I am not proposing anarchy. There is market failure in the world. Only the state can give us safety, the judiciary, okay, the Indian rupee. These are only things that can be produced by the state. So I think we need both. That to build a great country, we need both. We need the state, which will create conditions in which the imagination, the energy, the creativity of the private sector will create truth and beauty and science and wealth and prosperity. Okay, so it's a jugalbandi. You need both. You can't have one or the other. What is the national character of India? I think the closest we come to really is, Gandhiji and Nehru and Tagore. That is the character of India. So if you look back, we read Tryst with Destiny, we read Tagore, we read Gandhiji. That is who we are. I think that's the character of India.
Sir, can you give an example of unwarranted ED SFIO which we are talking about? You had a strong objection for ED SFIO.
Oh, they're just examples.
Can you give an example of unwarranted ED SFIO?
No, I will not go into specific cases. I will make a larger claim that if you are running a business in India today, you are under a tremendous level of risk. There are many agencies. You never know which of the agencies will start on you when. And there are many laws and regulations that you can trip over. So it has become a minefield. The mind share of the firms and the management is on managing the government environment, which is back to 1982. Okay. What we need is the mind share of the management should be on how do I make a better product, how do I compete, how do I improve my technology, how do I conquer global markets. That is what we are after.
I will answer your question after the
Last. Sir, I have two questions. One is related to direct tax. Because direct tax.
Direct tax, yeah.
Can India develop by repealing direct tax means as an individual I am paying tax at the time of earning income, at the time of even at the time of spending, no indirect taxes. And second question is on education and health. If you see as in Telangana, the last budget where on the education, the government has reduced the budget to 9,000 crores from 12,000 crores. And on at the same time, one policy program related to Kalyana Lakshmi, where government has increased to 12,000 crores. Okay, so like this, main basic necessities, basic requirements, where government is less spending, and so if government go like this, so what is the case? And one more thing, even in central level, government is reducing spending on education from, it is almost less than 1% compared with other European countries where they are spending almost 4 to 5% on education. So what is your opinion on this?
So our opinion in this book is that the Indian state has very low capability. The Indian state is a contractor that fumbles on whatever you ask him to do. So you should ask him to do less. We should pick a few bare minimum battles. We can think of 4 battles without which there is no civilization. They are criminal justice system, right? Without a criminal justice system, there is no civilization. Judiciary. Without a judiciary, there is no civilization. Taxation, because the government has to raise money, otherwise there is no government. and the basics of macroeconomic and financial stability. So we would argue that play these 4 battles, focus on these things, and when you have low capability, don't try to do too many things.
Very few countries in other countries, we have written the constitution which says the existing inequalities of opportunities should be reduced. Now, obviously, you are quoting Marx Weber, which says that state is an oppressive dictionary, less of this is. Now, obviously, you also said creational wealth is more important, not so Jeremy Benson's dictum. The duty of the state is to maximize the good of the maximum number of people gets lost. Number 1. Number 2, you quoted Gandhiji, who says that the state should do GDP. Gandhiji said, when you take a decision in power of authority, look at its effect on the poor man, see his face and take a decision. You also said incentive operates for the private sector and we should have private sector. The poor man's face is an incentive to the private sector to do anything, and finally it will result in what Piketty called British Raj to billionaire Raj.
So the directive principles of the Constitution are not important operative part of the Constitution of India. For all practical purposes today, we have to focus on the basic structure as the main operative engine of the Constitution. Other things can evolve. And so I think that our conception of the elements of the Constitution today has evolved quite a bit. In terms of thinking about poor people, I'm very optimistic. There is now ample evidence that poor people participate in a market economy and respond to incentives. So I think India has reached that stage where the marketization of the economy has happened. And as we all know, the great growth of 1991 to 2011 brought 350 million people out of poverty through their participation in market processes. So I feel the highway is now clear for us that let's get the next 10 times growth of the GDP and everybody will be better off instead of getting stuck on the problems of the structural inequalities and getting let's not have civil wars between ourselves. Let's just make progress in the aggregate. It's a safer, easier way to make progress.